A werewolf romance written by Olivia Smith. Prologue. The charcoal tasted like ash and survival. Every morning before the sun cracked the sky open, I sat in the dark corner of the servant quarters, grinding the black paste between my fingers until it was smooth enough to press against my eyes. It burned. It always burned. But pain was the price of breathing, and I had learned to pay it without flinching. My name is Seraphine Voss, and for 3 years, I have hidden the most dangerous thing about me behind a layer of soot and desperation. My eyes. My silver, shimmering, cursed eyes, the mark of the Lunara bloodline, the lineage the Alpha King Zevrath declared extinct by royal decree on the night of the blood crescent moon. He did not know one of us survived. He did not know I was scrubbing floors 10 feet from his throne room every single day. And he did not know that the moment the moonlight touched my face in the wrong way, everything I had built to stay alive would collapse in one terrifying second. That second came on a Tuesday, and it changed everything. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Chapter 1, The Shimmer. The rain had no mercy that night. It came down in cold, heavy sheets, soaking through the thin wool of my servant's uniform and plastering my dark hair flat against my face. I had been sent to the eastern courtyard to collect the Alpha King's ceremonial banners before they were ruined by the storm, a task no senior servant wanted because the eastern courtyard sat directly beneath the open sky, unshielded, exposed. It was the worst place to be in a downpour. I knew that. I went anyway, because refusing an order in Zevrath's palace meant something far worse than wet clothes. I moved fast, yanking the heavy banners from their iron poles, my fingers numb, my boots soaking through. The torches along the courtyard walls had mostly died in the wind. Only 2 remained lit, throwing unsteady orange light across the wet stone. I kept my head down. I always kept my head down. 3 years of survival had trained my spine to curve, my gaze to drop, my presence to shrink. I was furniture. I was shadow. I was nothing worth looking at. That was exactly how I needed it to stay. I had almost finished. 3 banners down, 1 to go. The last banner was wrapped around a pole near the courtyard's central fountain, an enormous stone structure carved in the shape of a snarling wolf, water pouring from its open jaws even in the storm. I hated that fountain. There was something alive in the way it watched. I reached the pole and began unwinding the banner, working quickly, fingers trembling not just from the cold, but from the familiar low hum of anxiety that lived permanently in my chest. Then the rain shifted. It came sideways, sudden and violent, and hit me full in the face. I gasped, stumbling back a step. My hand flew to my eyes instinctively. Too late. The water had already done its work. I felt it before I saw the reaction. The burning, cool sensation across my irises as the charcoal paste dissolved, thinned, ran in dark rivulets down my cheeks like I was crying black tears. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked. My breath stopped existing. The courtyard was not empty. I had not heard them arrive over the sound of the storm. 3 of them, royal guards in black and silver armor, standing at the courtyard entrance with a lantern between them. They were doing a perimeter sweep. Standard procedure. Routine. Harmless on any other night. But the one holding the lantern had already turned toward me. The light swung in my direction, lazy and casual, and then it stopped. He lifted it higher. I could not move. My legs had forgotten what they were for. The lantern light reached my face, caught the wet silver shimmer of my uncovered eyes, and the guard's expression shifted from bored to horrified in the span of a single breath. He knew. They all knew. Every citizen of this kingdom had been shown illustrations of the silver-eyed lineage since childhood, taught to recognize the mark, taught to report it immediately, taught that harboring one was punishable by death. His hand dropped to his sword. "Silver eyes," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. "She has silver eyes." Everything happened at once. I ran. I did not decide to run. My body simply chose survival over paralysis and launched itself toward the far end of the courtyard before my mind had processed a single thought. I heard the guards shouting behind me, heard the metallic scream of swords leaving sheaths, heard boots slamming against wet stone. I vaulted over a low garden wall, nearly went down on the slick grass beyond it, caught myself on my palms and kept moving. My heart was a war drum. My lungs burned. I had rehearsed this moment in my nightmares 1,000 times. The moment the disguise failed. The moment the mask came off. The moment 3 years of careful, aching invisibility dissolved into a single, catastrophic second. I had always told myself I had a plan. I had always told myself I would be calm. I was not calm. I was terrified, and I was running straight into the one wing of the palace I had always avoided, the Alpha King's private corridor. The doors at the end of the hall swung open, and Zevrath stepped out. He looked at me. I looked at him. The silver in my eyes caught the hallway torchlight and threw it back like twin mirrors. His jaw tightened. His golden gaze dropped to my irises and locked there, unreadable, absolute, the way a predator looks at something it has cornered and is still deciding what to do with. The guards crashed into the hallway behind me, out of breath, hands on their weapons, already calling out the order. "My king! She carries the Lunara mark. She must be executed immediately, by decree." The word executed landed in the hallway like a stone dropped into still water. I watched the ripples cross Zevrath's face. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, slowly, he raised one hand, not toward me, but toward his guards. A single, flat signal. "Stop." The guards froze. I stopped breathing entirely. Zevrath took one step forward, then another, until he was close enough that I could see the faint scar along his jaw and the gold threads woven into his black collar. He studied my face with an expression I had no name for. Then he said 4 words that made no sense at all. "Don't let her fall." Chapter 2. The Decree. I was 6 years old the first time I understood what my eyes meant. My mother, Thessaly Voss, had a way of delivering devastating truths in the quietest possible voice, as if lowering the volume might soften the weight of the words. She sat across from me at our small kitchen table in the village of Duskfen, a candle burning low between us, and she told me that the Alpha King had signed a decree 3 days prior. She held my face between her hands while she spoke, her thumbs pressed gently against my cheekbones. Her own eyes, brown, safe, unremarkable, filled with a grief so old it had stopped being sharp and become simply permanent. The Lunara bloodline, she explained, had been declared enemies of the crown. Silver-eyed descendants of the original wolf ancestors, once revered as sacred, had been reclassified overnight as threats to the natural order. The decree used careful language. Words like purification and restoration of balance. What it meant, stripped of its formal dressing, was simple. Anyone born with silver eyes was to be reported, arrested, and executed. No trials, no exceptions, no mercy. She had known this was coming. Thessaly had heard the whispers 2 weeks before the official announcement, carried into Duskfen by a traveling merchant who had seen the notice posted on the gates of Velmor, the capital city. She had spent those 2 weeks preparing. She ground the first batch of charcoal paste herself, testing it on her own arm before she trusted it near my eyes. She practiced the application method 14 times on a cloth doll before she touched my face. She was precise, and she was thorough, and she was absolutely terrified, though she never let me see that last part until much later. By the time the decree reached Duskfen officially, arriving in the hands of 2 royal messengers on black horses, I already had brown eyes, or something that looked enough like brown eyes to pass a doorway inspection. My mother was many things. Above all, she was a woman who refused to let the world take her daughter without a fight. She taught me the ritual the same morning she first applied it. The ritual was not simple. The charcoal had to be the right kind, dense, mineral-rich, ground to a fine powder before being mixed with a small amount of rendered fat to help it adhere to the surface of the eye. Too thin, and it would dissolve in tears or sweat within hours. Too thick, and it would clump, making the iris look muddy and unnatural, which drew exactly the kind of scrutiny we could not afford. My mother spent months refining the formula. She sourced the charcoal from a specific tree whose bark burned dense and slow. She kept 3 batches prepared at all times in a small clay pot with a sealed lid, hidden beneath a loose stone in our kitchen floor. Every morning before dawn, she would apply the paste to my irises using the tip of her smallest finger, pressing gently in slow circular motions while I sat perfectly still and breathed through my nose. It hurt every time. She always apologized. I always told her it was fine. Neither of us believed that, but we both needed the ritual to feel manageable, so we kept our language gentle and our movements practiced. The day the inspectors came to Duskfen, I was 9 years old. They arrived on a cold morning in early winter, 4 of them in the Alpha King's colors, moving door to door through the village with a list of registered households and a very specific set of questions. My mother answered the door herself. I stood 3 feet behind her, eyes down, hands folded, the picture of an ordinary child. The inspector barely looked at me. He asked my mother the standard questions: full names, bloodline registration, any known Lunara ancestry. My mother lied without flinching. Clean, practiced lies delivered in the tone of a woman who had nothing to hide. She had rehearsed those lies the way she had rehearsed the charcoal application, carefully, repetitively, until they sat in her mouth like truth. The inspector marked something on his list and moved on. When the door closed, my mother turned to face me. She did not cry. She simply crossed the room, knelt in front of me, and pressed her forehead to mine for a long, quiet moment. "Still here," she whispered. It became our phrase. The thing we said to each other every time we survived something that should have ended us. She did not survive the 3rd inspection. I was 13. The inspector that year was different, younger, sharper, clearly ambitious. He asked to see each family member individually, in separate rooms, without explanation. "A new protocol," he said. "Standard procedure." My mother went first. I waited in the kitchen, counting the knots in the wooden table, telling myself it would be fine. I heard her voice, low and steady, answering questions. Then I heard the pause. Then I heard the inspector's voice change, shorter, harder, stripped of its official politeness. Then I heard my mother say, "Still here," in a tone I had never heard from her before. Not a whisper this time. A declaration. They took her 20 minutes later. I watched from the narrow gap between the kitchen door and its frame, my hand pressed over my mouth, my silver eyes wide and burning and hidden behind their mask of ash. I watched them take her out the front door and into the cold morning light. She did not look back. She had told me once, very specifically, never to run after her if this day came. She had made me promise. I kept the promise. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, and I have done many hard things since. Chapter 3, Servant and Shadow. I arrived at Velmore Palace with borrowed shoes and a stolen name. The shoes belonged to a girl named Riva, who had died of fever in the refugee camp outside the city walls the previous winter. She had been roughly my size, quiet and unmemorable, the kind of person the world forgets quickly, which made her identity useful. I had not stolen it with pride. I had taken it with the specific, pragmatic grief of someone who had already used up their allotment of moral hesitation. Survival has its own arithmetic. I applied to the palace servant registry under her name, using a set of documentation that a forger in the camp's back quarter had produced for 3 silver coins and no questions. The documentation was good. The forger was professional. I passed the initial inspection without difficulty and was assigned to the lowest tier of palace service: floor scrubbing, laundry hauling, ash removal from the fireplaces in the outer wing. Hard work. Invisible work. Exactly the kind of work that put me close to the palace's rhythms without drawing any attention to my face. It was, in its way, a perfect hiding place. No one looks at the girl on her knees with a scrubbing brush. The palace was enormous and deliberately intimidating. Velmore Palace sat on a raised plateau at the center of the capital city, visible from every district, its black stone towers rising against the sky like a declaration. Inside, it was a city within a city, hundreds of rooms, dozens of corridors, an entire underground network of servant passages that ran parallel to the main hallways so that staff could move through the building without disrupting the sightlines of the nobility. I learned those passages within my first week, mapping them in my memory the way my mother had taught me to map any new environment. Exits first, then blind spots, then the patterns of whoever holds power. The head housekeeper, a severe woman named Durva, assigned territories to each servant and enforced them with rigid precision. Mine was the outer east wing, which included 7 rooms, 2 corridor stretches, and the eastern courtyard. I stayed in my territory. I did my work. I kept my eyes down and my charcoal fresh, and my presence as close to invisible as human anatomy allowed. There were others who noticed me anyway. Not for the right reasons, or rather, not for the dangerous ones. Merrick, a senior stable hand with a wide, easy laugh, started leaving extra bread on the edge of my supply cart about 6 weeks into my tenure. He never said why. I never asked. Jorvin, one of the junior footmen, had a habit of positioning himself between me and Durva whenever the head housekeeper was in a mood that promised punishment for minor infractions. He was subtle about it, always had a plausible reason to be standing exactly where he stood. But I noticed. These small kindnesses existed in the palace the way wildflowers exist in cracked pavement. Unexpected, fragile, and somehow more beautiful for the difficulty of the ground they grew from. I was careful not to lean on them too heavily. Attachment was a vulnerability. Every person who knew my face was a potential witness. I kept my gratitude quiet and my distance consistent, and told myself this was wisdom rather than loneliness. The Alpha King was rarely visible to servants of my tier. Zevrath Kyle ruled from the upper palace, the throne room, the war chamber, the private wing that occupied the entire northern section of the building. Servants below the 3rd rank did not enter those spaces. We heard him occasionally, his voice carried when he was angry, a deep, controlled sound that moved through the palace walls like thunder moving through stone. We heard stories about him constantly. The senior servants spoke of him in careful, economical language. Effective, they said. Decisive. Fair in his governance, if not in his mercy. The word ruthless appeared frequently, always spoken in a tone that suggested the speaker was not entirely sure whether this was a criticism or a compliment. I heard his name every day for 2 years, and constructed an image of him entirely from second-hand accounts and the evidence of his policies, including the decree that had taken my mother and made my eyes a crime. I told myself I hated him. It was a clean, useful emotion. It kept me focused. Then the Harvest Festival changed everything. Once a year, Velmore Palace opened its outer halls to a formal celebration, the Festival of the Crescent, marking the anniversary of the kingdom's founding. For 3 days, the boundary between upper and lower palace blurred slightly. Senior nobility moved through spaces they normally ignored, and servants of all tiers were required to maintain the public-facing areas, which meant exposure to parts of the palace, and people we usually never encountered. On the 2nd evening of the festival, I was assigned to the long gallery corridor, polishing the floor sections between the decorative columns, while guests moved overhead on the raised walkway. I was on my knees, head down, cloth moving in slow circles, when I heard footsteps on the gallery above me stop. I did not look up. Looking up was not something I did, but I felt the weight of someone's attention settle on the back of my neck with the specific pressure of a gaze that is not casual. I kept polishing. The attention did not move. When I finally, carefully raised my eyes, just enough to scan the gallery without lifting my head, I saw a pair of boots at the railing's edge, black leather, gold clasps. The footwear of someone who did not need to announce their rank, because everything about them already did. The Alpha King stood above me, looking down. And even from that distance, even with my charcoal mask in perfect condition, something in his expression suggested he was trying to solve a problem he could not yet name. Chapter 4. The cost of almost the festival ended. The watching did not. I noticed it first in small things. A reassignment of my cleaning territory, subtle, unsigned, slipped into the weekly roster by Durva's hand, but originating, I suspected, somewhere above her authority. My new territory included 2 corridors in the middle palace that I'd never worked before. Corridors that ran adjacent to the council chamber. Corridors that, on 3 separate occasions in the following week, The Alpha King passed through at times that did not align with any schedule a servant of my rank would have access to. I told myself this was coincidence. I am very good at telling myself useful lies when the truth is too dangerous to hold still and examine. I kept my head down. I kept my rhythm. I kept my charcoal paste in the small clay pot I had replicated from my mother's original design, tucked into the inner pocket of my uniform jacket, where it sat against my ribs like a second heartbeat, cold in the morning, warm by midday, always there, always necessary. I reapplied it twice daily now, instead of once. The additional application burned more. I welcomed the burn. Pain is clarifying. Myarick noticed the reassignment. He mentioned it one afternoon while I was collecting ash buckets from the outer kitchen yard, his tone carefully casual in the way of someone who was actually quite concerned. "East Corridor reassignment's unusual," he said, not looking at me, sorting through a pile of leather straps with focused attention. "Derva doesn't move people without reason." "Maybe she needed someone reliable there?" I said. Myarick made a sound that was not agreement. He glanced sideways at me then, a brief, measuring look, and I saw the moment he decided not to push further. He was smart enough to know when a person was carrying something they couldn't share, and kind enough to leave them their dignity about it. "Extra bread's on the cart," he said instead. I thanked him and left before the conversation could develop edges. I sat with his words all evening, though, turning them in my mind the way you turn a stone in your palm, looking for cracks. Derva doesn't move people without reason. Someone had moved me. Someone with enough authority to make Derva comply without question. The arithmetic of that was uncomfortable. 3 days later, I found the letter. It was tucked into the supply cabinet at the entrance of my assigned corridor, folded once, no seal, no name on the outside. I almost missed it. My hand brushed it while reaching for a cleaning cloth, and the texture was wrong. Too smooth, too deliberate among the rough-edged utility linens. I pulled it free and unfolded it in the dim light of the cabinet alcove, my pulse already doing something unpleasant. The handwriting was clean and authoritative. The message was 5 words. "I know what you hide." Nothing else. No signature. No threat elaborated. Just those 5 words sitting in the center of the page, like a stone dropped through ice. I stood in that alcove for a very long time. My first impulse was flight. Pack nothing, leave tonight, disappear into the city and rebuild from nothing the way I had done before. My second impulse, arriving half a breath behind the first, was colder and more analytical. If whoever wrote this had wanted me reported, they would have reported me. A letter was a communication. A letter meant they wanted something else. That understanding did not make me feel better. But it changed the shape of my fear from blind panic into something more navigable. I burned the letter in one of the fireplace grates I was assigned to clean that evening. I watched it curl and blacken and disappear, and I applied a 3rd coat of charcoal paste that night with hands that were not entirely steady. The following morning, I reported to my corridor at the usual time and worked with my usual precision. Nothing changed visibly. No one approached me. No second letter appeared. But on the second morning, when I arrived at the corridor's entrance, I found something sitting on the supply cabinet shelf that had not been there the night before. A small jar. Dark clay, sealed lid. I opened it with fingers that already knew what they would find. Fresh charcoal paste. High quality, denser than anything I had access to through normal means, ground finer than I could manage with my own tools. The formula was almost exactly right. Almost. Whoever had prepared it had come very close, but not close enough, which told me they had been working from observation rather than knowledge. They had watched me apply it. They had studied the result and tried to replicate the process. And then they had left this on my shelf, like a message written in a language only I could read. "I see you. I know what you are. And I am not, at this moment, destroying you." I used the paste. I am not proud of that decision. It felt like accepting something from a hand I could not see, which every instinct my mother had built into me screamed against. But the quality was genuinely superior to my own supply, and survival has its own arithmetic, and I had learned long ago that pride is a luxury that costs more than most people can afford. I applied it that morning with careful, practiced strokes, and went about my day and tried very hard not to think about the fact that somewhere in this enormous palace, Someone knew my secret and had chosen, for reasons entirely their own, to keep it. The knowing sat in my chest alongside the familiar anxiety, different in texture, neither safer nor more dangerous, just present. A new variable in an equation I had been solving for 3 years. That evening, Jorvin fell into step beside me in the servant corridor, his voice barely above a murmur. "Word from the upper floors," he said, not looking at me. "The King's been pulling personnel files." He paused. "Including yours." I kept walking. My face stayed neutral. But behind my charcoal-darkened eyes, the silver light that no one was supposed to see burned a little brighter, with something that was not quite fear, and not quite hope, and had no clean name yet. Chapter 5. Named and Known. He summoned me on a Wednesday morning. Not through Durva. Not through the formal chain of servant administration that governed every aspect of palace life below the upper floors. Directly. A single royal guard appearing at the entrance of my corridor at the start of my shift, delivering a verbal instruction in a tone that made clear this was not a request in any sense of the word that mattered. "The Alpha King requires your presence in the Eastern Study." Now, I set down my cleaning cloth. I straightened my uniform. I pressed 2 fingers briefly to my chest where the clay pot rested against my ribs, just to confirm it was there. Then I followed the guard through corridors I had never walked, up a staircase I had never used, into a section of the palace where the air was warmer and the stone was darker, and everything felt heavier with the weight of the authority that lived there. The Eastern Study was smaller than I had expected, lined with maps rather than books. A single wide window overlooking the inner courtyard, morning light coming through it in a long, slanted column. Zevrath Kyle stood at that window with his back to me when I entered. The guard closed the door behind me and did not stay. The silence lasted long enough to be intentional. I stood near the door. I kept my eyes at a middle distance, not down, which would look like guilt, not up, which would invite scrutiny. I had learned that middle distance over years of practice. The place where you existed without declaring yourself. Zevrath turned eventually, moving away from the window with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never needed to rush because the world rearranges itself around his schedule. He was taller in person than the impression his voice had given me through walls. Broader. The scar along his jaw was more visible in morning light, a clean diagonal line that suggested something fast and intentional rather than accidental. His eyes were gold. Not amber, not hazel. Gold, the specific warm metallic shade that marked the royal Kale bloodline, as distinctly as silver marked mine. He crossed the room until he was standing at the near edge of his desk, which put approximately 4 feet of open space between us. He looked at my face with the direct, undecorated attention of someone who has already decided to stop pretending to look at something else. "Your name," he said, not a question. "Riva," I said. "The borrowed name. The dead girl's gift." Something moved across his expression. Too fast to catalog. "Your real name," he said. The correction was quiet and absolute. He said it the way you say something you already know the answer to, but want to give the other person the dignity of saying it themselves. I held very still for a moment. The arithmetic of this situation was fast and complicated. He had my file. He had watched me. He had sent the letter and the charcoal paste, and had not reported me through any of it. The question now was not whether he knew. The question was what knowing cost me versus what telling the truth gained me, and whether there was any version of this room I walked out of safely, regardless of what I said. "Seraphne," I said. "Seraphne Voss." My mother's name lived inside my last name, like a hidden room. Saying it out loud in this palace felt like opening a window I had kept shuttered for 3 years. Cold and necessary all at once. Zevrath repeated it once, quietly, as if testing its weight. Then he said, "Sit down, Seraphne Voss. We have a great deal to discuss." The conversation that followed dismantled every version of reality I had constructed. He knew about the Lunara lineage with a specificity that went far beyond the public decree. The real history, not the official revision. He spoke of the silver-eyed descendants not as threats, but as the original arbiters of the Moon Bond, the wolves whose gift for recognizing fated pairings had been woven into the kingdom's founding. He spoke of the decree with an expression I struggled to read. Not pride, not regret exactly, but something in the territory between them that suggested a more complicated relationship with that document than I had ever permitted myself to imagine. He told me that the purge had been initiated not by his own judgment, but by his late father's counsel in the final weeks of the previous king's reign, passed into law 3 days before Zevrath took the throne. He had inherited it the way you inherit a debt, not of your making, bound to you regardless. I could not repeal it immediately, he said, without the council perceiving weakness in my first days of rule. He paused. So, I did not repeal it immediately. The careful precision of that phrasing, immediately, carried more weight than anything else he had said. I did not know what to do with a complicated Zevrath. My hatred of him had been clean and simple, and extremely functional. It had given me shape in the dark years after my mother, something hard to press my back against when everything else was fluid and threatening. A villain who signed decrees and sent executioners was a villain I knew how to survive. A king who inherited an unjust law and was maneuvering carefully around his own council towards something I couldn't yet see. That was a problem with no established protocol. I sat across from him in that study with my charcoal-darkened eyes and my dead girl's name dissolving between us, and tried to reorganize 3 years of carefully maintained hatred into something that fit the actual shape of the man in front of me. I could not do it in one sitting. I did not trust the attempt, but I noticed against my will and my better judgment that he had not once looked at my eyes with disgust. He looked at them the way you look at something rare that you have been searching for a very long time, as if finding it was not victory but relief. I noticed that, and I filed it somewhere I could not yet name, and I told myself I would examine it later when my heart was less loud. Chapter 6. Threads and Traps. I was not the only one he was protecting. This was the first thread, and I pulled it carefully, slowly, over the days that followed our meeting in the Eastern study. Zevrath did not summon me again immediately. A week passed, then another, during which I continued my work in the reassigned corridor, and tried to behave like someone whose entire understanding of her situation had not just been rearranged. But I was watching now with different eyes, or rather, the same eyes with a different intention behind them. And what I saw, when I looked with that sharper attention, was a pattern of small, deliberate protections scattered through the palace like seeds. A servant girl in the laundry wing, who always kept her sleeves rolled down regardless of the heat, hiding, I eventually realized, a birthmark on her inner wrist that bore a Lunara-adjacent shape. An elderly groundskeeper who pruned the garden hedges in a specific, repetitive pattern that I recognized after 2 weeks as a Lunara morning ritual, performed in plain sight by someone who had been performing it so long, no one remembered what they were looking at anymore. They were here. Others, tucked into the palace's corners, hiding in their various ways. And Zevrath knew. The second thread was the council. I learned about them gradually, in pieces, through overheard conversations in the corridor, through Jorvin's careful fragments of information, through the specific silences that fell in rooms when certain names were mentioned. The ruling council of Velmor consisted of 7 lords, each commanding significant military and financial resources, each with vested interest in the policies of the current reign. 3 of them had been architects of the original Purge Decree. These 3, Lord Carvin, Lord Mossick, and the eldest, Lord Thray, had continued to apply pressure on Zevrath to demonstrate active enforcement of the decree since his ascension. They commissioned inspection sweeps. They funded the Executioner Corps. They watched the numbers of reported and eliminated Lunara descendants the way merchants watch inventory. They were not ideologues, I came to understand. They were pragmatists who had decided long ago that the silver-eyed lineage represented a structural threat to a power arrangement they had built their families' futures around. Eliminating the lineage was not about purity. It was about removing the one bloodline with the gifts to see clearly enough to expose them. That realization landed in me like cold water. My lineage had not been targeted because we were dangerous in any violent sense. We had been targeted because we could see the Moon Bond gift, the ability to read connections and intentions and hidden allegiances with a clarity that most wolves could not access. We were inconvenient to people who depended on others not seeing them clearly. I sat with this knowledge in the quiet of the servant dormitory for a full night, listening to the breathing of the other girls around me, and staring at the ceiling, and felt something shift in my chest that was not grief and not anger, but something older than both of them. Purpose. The thin, sharp edge of it, like a blade you've just found the handle of. My mother had died because 3 lords needed their arrangements to stay hidden. That changed the texture of everything. It made my survival not just personal, but pointed. I was not simply hiding. I was carrying something they needed erased, and I was still carrying it, and the Alpha King, for reasons I had not yet fully excavated, was standing between me and the people trying to finish what his father's council had started. Zevrath summoned me again on a Thursday evening. This time the guard arrived at my dormitory rather than my corridor, an unusual choice that suggested either urgency or a deliberate departure from protocol. I followed through the now familiar upper floor route to a different room this time, a smaller chamber adjacent to the study, clearly a private receiving room rather than a working space. Zevrath was already seated when I entered, not behind a desk, but in one of 2 chairs positioned near the unlit fireplace, facing each other, with a low table between them carrying 2 cups of something hot. The second chair was clearly for me. The informality of it was jarring enough that I hesitated in the doorway. He gestured to the chair with a straightforwardness that left no room for the hesitation to become refusal. I sat. He looked at me for a moment without speaking, in the way he had, direct, considering, not unkind. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it without deciding immediately what it means." I wrapped my hands around the warm cup. "I'll try," I said. It was the most honest thing I had offered him. "There's a 3rd inspection sweep scheduled," he said. "Larger than the previous ones. Council initiated. Carvin's man is leading it. It begins in 14 days. He paused. "And they have a new detection method." My hands tightened on the cup. "What kind of method?" I said. My voice came out steadier than I deserved credit for. Zevrath reached into his jacket and placed a small document on the table between us, a technical summary, dense with notation I could only partially follow. But I understood enough. A compound solution, chemically developed, that could be applied to any surface or skin. When it contacted the specific mineral compound present in Lunera eye pigment, a compound distinct at a molecular level from standard iris coloration, it caused a visible reaction. A faint luminescence, present for approximately 10 seconds. Enough time for identification. The charcoal paste would not interfere. The disguise my mother had perfected, and I had maintained for 9 years, would not hold against this. Every hidden Lunara descendant in the palace, the laundry girl, the old groundskeeper, anyone else I hadn't yet identified, would be exposed within the first hour of the sweep. And so would I. 14 days. I looked at Zevrath across the low table. He looked back. "I can delay the sweep," he said carefully. "I cannot stop it without triggering exactly the kind of council confrontation I'm not yet positioned to win." The word yet again. Deliberate and weighted. "What I need," he continued, "is your help to do something I cannot do alone." I waited. His golden eyes were steady and unreadable. "I need a silver-eyed witness," he said quietly, "who can see what I cannot." Chapter 7. The gift they tried to bury. I had not used the gift in years. My mother called it moonsight, the Lunara ability to read the invisible bonds between people, the threads of loyalty and hidden allegiance and unspoken truth that connected one wolf to another. It was not magic in the dramatic sense. It did not grant visions or predict futures. What it did was more precise and, in many ways, more dangerous. It allowed the silver-eyed to perceive the quality of a connection between 2 people, whether it was genuine or performed, whether trust was real or manufactured, whether what someone said aligned with the current running beneath their words. My mother had described it as hearing the note underneath the note, the real sound beneath the presented one. I had used it instinctively as a small child, the way children use their senses without naming them. After the decree, after my mother's deliberate and thorough training in how to survive, I had learned to suppress it. A gift that required you to truly see people was a catastrophic liability when your survival depended on no one truly seeing you. I had locked it down, layer by layer, until I could barely feel it anymore. A sealed room, a stilled frequency, years of deliberate silence. Zevrath needed me to open it again. He explained what he needed in careful, factual terms over the course of 2 evenings. Information he had been assembling for months about the council's internal structure, about who among the 7 lords was genuinely committed to the Purge ideology, and who was simply compliant from political pressure or personal fear. He suspected at least 2 of the 7 were not ideological allies of Carvin and Thray, but rather captured participants, performing loyalty they did not feel because the cost of not performing it seemed too high. If he could identify which 2, he could approach them privately, offer them an exit from the arrangement that cost them less than the current cost of staying. He needed leverage to begin dismantling the council majority before the sweep gave the hardliners an excuse to consolidate power further. What he needed from me was confirmation, a reading of the council members in a situation where I could observe them without being observed. He needed my moonsight to tell him if he was reading the room correctly. And if I'm wrong about which ones, I asked, then I move on a bad read, and the consequences fall on me, he said. No hesitation. I studied his face with the careful attention I had developed over years of reading people through peripheral vision and guarded glances. He was telling the truth. The steadiness of it, uncomplicated, no secondary calculation visible beneath the primary one, was either genuine or the most sophisticated performance I had ever encountered. I decided, with the specific recklessness of someone who has run out of fully safe options, to believe it was genuine. Not because I was certain. Because the alternative, staying in the defensive crouch I'd held for 3 years, while the new detection method moved toward me like weather, was no longer a viable form of survival. Hiding is not the same as living. My mother had built me to survive. She had also, I was only now beginning to remember, built me to eventually be more than just a survivor. I looked at Zevrath Kale and said, I'll need 3 days to practice before I can give you anything reliable. He nodded. Take 4, he said. Get it right. The practice was disorienting. Unlocking a suppressed sense is not like flicking a switch. It is more like removing a bandage from a wound that has partially healed in the wrong position. The first day, I sat in a corner of the outer courtyard during a free hour and tried to look at the passing servants with the old open attention, trying to let the moonsight move the way it had moved when I was a child. Nothing happened, except a low headache and a vague, unfocused impression of noise. The second day was worse. The sense came back in fragments, erratic and overwhelming, flooding me with impressions I couldn't sort or interpret. Merrick passed me in the corridor, and I caught a flash of something. Not his usual warmth, but an undercurrent of anxiety, recent and sharp. I tracked it to a short exchange I had seen him have with one of the council's inspection representatives that morning. The anxiety made sense in that context. He was afraid of being implicated in something. Not guilty, afraid. I recognized the difference. By the 3rd day, the control was coming back. Imperfect, effortful, but usable. By the 4th day, I sat across from Zevrath in the receiving room and told him what I had managed to recover. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, Good. There's a council dinner in 6 days. You'll be serving. The fear came back all at once. Serving. I repeated the word with the flat tone of someone confirming they heard correctly. As a servant, he said, as if this clarification was helpful. Same role? Different room? I looked at him. He looked back. Lord Carvin will be seated to my left, he said. Lord Thray to my right. The 2 I believe are captured rather than committed will be at the far end of the table. I need you close enough to read all 4. The problem with this plan was both obvious and numerous. Walking into a room containing the architects of my lineage's purge, with only a layer of charcoal paste between me and identification, while actively using a gift that required me to lower every guard I had built. The risk architecture of this was breathtaking. If the new detection compound has been pre-tested, I said, and if any of the lords bring it to the dinner, the compound is in the custody of Carvin's laboratory, Zevrath said. It won't be at the dinner. You're certain? No, he said. and I found, strangely, that his honesty about the uncertainty was more convincing than certainty would have been. He was not selling me safety. He was offering me a real choice with real odds. I breathed through the fear and held it steady and said, "I'll need a better uniform." Chapter 8. The Table. The council dinner was on a Friday evening in late autumn. The great dining hall of Velmore Palace ran along the northern face of the building, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountain range that edged the kingdom's northern border. At this time of year, those mountains wore the first snow of the season on their peaks, white against the gray evening sky like a clean edge drawn with a ruler. The hall was lit by 3 enormous iron chandeliers carrying hundreds of candles, their combined light warm and slightly orange against the dark stone walls. 12 council members in total were expected. The full 7+5 visiting lords from allied territories, invited ostensibly as a diplomatic courtesy. And actually, Zevrath had explained briefly, as witnesses he wanted in the room for reasons that would become clear. I arrived with the serving staff an hour before the guests, helping set the long table under Durva's supervision, moving with the practiced invisibility I had spent 3 years perfecting. My new uniform was marginally better quality than my standard issue. Still servant grade, still functionally anonymous, but cleaner lines, less wear visible at the cuffs. Durva had not questioned the reassignment. She questioned very little that came from the upper floors. The guests arrived in stages. I catalogued them the way my mother had taught me to catalog any room of powerful people. Exits, attention patterns, who looked at whom first, who avoided whose eyes. Lord Carvin entered third, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with the specific kind of confidence that comes from never having had a plan fail badly enough to teach him caution. Lord Thray was older, quieter, and watched the room with pale, careful eyes that missed very little. The 2 I was most interested in, Lord Veskin and Lord Orin, the ones Zevrath suspected of captured loyalty, arrived together, talking in low voices, with the slightly over-relaxed manner of people who are working quite hard to appear relaxed. I noted that. I kept my face neutral and my movements routine, and began to let the moon sight open, slowly, carefully, like opening a window in a wind. Controlled crack, then wider, then managing what came through. The impressions arrived in layers. Carvin read clean and committed. His allegiance to the purge policy was genuine ideology, not performance. He believed it. That was almost worse than cynicism. Thray was more complex. His surface read was confident authority, but beneath it ran something older and more tired. The specific exhaustion of a man who made a decision long ago that he cannot unmake and has been justifying ever since. Not doubt exactly, but the ghost of it, walled off and plastered over with decades of conviction. He was not a man I could reach, but he was a man who would, I thought, respond badly to having the ghost let out. The 2 at the far end of the table, Veskin and Orin, were exactly what Zevrath had suspected. Veskin's loyalty read as pure performance anxiety. He was afraid of Carvin, afraid of Thray, afraid of the cost of misalignment with the majority position. There was no genuine ideological content to his compliance. It was the compliance of a man holding his breath, waiting for someone to make the room safe enough to exhale. Orin was different. His read was anger. Specifically, a long-suppressed anger at having been maneuvered into a position he had not fully understood when he agreed to it. He felt trapped. The rage underneath his courteous dinner-table manner was cold and thorough. Both men were reachable. Both men, given the right opening, would move. I refilled wine glasses. I cleared bread plates. I moved through the room like furniture. Midway through the main course, the conversation at the table shifted. Not dramatically, just the natural drift of powerful people relaxing into their second glass of wine, moving from formal topics to slightly less formal ones. Carvin said something about the upcoming sweep. He used the word cleansing without any apparent awareness that this was monstrous language for what he was describing. Veskin laughed at approximately the right moment, the laugh slightly too prompt. Orin said nothing and very precisely did not look at anything specific, which in Moonsight read as a man pressing his rage down with both hands. Zevrath, at the head of the table, listened to Carvin's commentary on the sweep with an expression of moderate interest that gave away absolutely nothing. He caught my eye exactly once as I moved past his chair, a fraction of a second, not long enough to be noticed by anyone watching, but enough. I gave him the smallest nod I could manage. 2 at the far end. Reachable. He returned his attention to Carvin. Something shifted in the set of his shoulders. Almost imperceptible. The tension of a man who just confirmed his read was correct. The dinner ended without incident. I thought that was it. I thought I had done the thing and survived it, and the rest was Zevrath's work to do from here. I was carrying the cleared dessert dishes back through the service passage when Durva stopped me at the passage entrance with a look I had never seen on her face before. She was pale. Her usual severity had a different quality to it, not authority, but fear trying to wear authority's clothes. Lord Carvin's personal guard, she said very quietly, is conducting a spot inspection. The new compound. My hands went still on the dish stack. Now? Now. East Passage first. The East Passage was directly behind me. I heard the footsteps before Durva finished the sentence. Heavy, rhythmic, moving fast. And in the kitchen doorway at the far end, I saw Merrick, and he was looking at me with the same washed pale expression Durva wore, and in his eyes was the specific combination of helplessness and apology that people wear when they have failed to stop something they tried to stop. There was nowhere to go. The passage was narrow. The footsteps were close. I set the dishes down very carefully, the way you set something down that you know you will not be picking up again, and I turned around. Chapter 9, Silver and Fire. The guard had the compound in a glass vial. It was smaller than I had expected, a thin tube of clear liquid that caught the candlelight with an almost innocent shimmer, nothing about it visually suggesting the catastrophic thing it could do. The guard was young, efficient, expressionless in the specific way of someone executing an order rather than making a decision. He had 2 additional guards with him and a sealed document that I assumed was Carvin's authorization. He held the vial up and uncapped it and looked at me across the narrow passage with no particular hostility and said, "Eyes forward, face still." I had approximately 3 seconds. I thought of my mother, not as memory, as instruction. Thessaly Voss had spent years preparing me for exactly this moment, the one where the disguise fails, and the prepared response becomes the only thing between survival and the alternative. She had told me once during a late night in Duskfin when I was perhaps 11, that the day the charcoal failed, I should stop hiding and start moving. Not running, moving. There is a difference. Running is panic. Moving is purpose. I moved. I stepped back and turned in the same motion, using the narrow passage walls for speed rather than fighting them, and went through the kitchen door at the far end before the guards had finished reacting to the fact that I was no longer standing still. Behind me, I heard the shout, sharp, controlled, the voice of someone trained, and then the heavier sound of pursuit in a tight space. I went through the kitchen, past the wide-eyed prep cook who flattened himself against the wall, through the back supply entrance, and into the outer corridor that ran perpendicular to the main palace hall. I did not go for an exit. I went up. The servants' staircase at the corridor's end took me to the middle floor, and I went up again, the charcoal paste running in dark lines down my face now from the exertion, my silver eyes completely uncovered, shimmering in the corridor torchlight like 2 small moons that had lost their way indoors. I had stopped caring about hiding them. That ship had burned. What mattered now was the only door I could think of that might be a destination rather than a dead end. The Eastern Study. I hit the door without knocking. Zevrath was already standing. He had heard the pursuit, or felt it through the palace's alerting system, or simply known in the way that the most dangerous version of this story required him to know. His 2 personal guards were at the room's entrance, and one of them stepped forward immediately with a hand on his weapon. I stopped in the doorway, breathing hard, charcoal-streaked, silver-eyed. Every disguise I owned dissolved into nothing. Carvin's 3 guards arrived at the corridor entrance behind me, before anyone in the room had moved. The lead guard's voice carried clear and official. "By order of Lord Carvin, this servant is to be detained for Lunara identification." Silence. The kind of silence that is actually several people simultaneously calculating. Then Zevrath walked forward, past his own guard, past me, positioning himself in the doorway between the corridor and the room, facing Carvin's man. "Lord Carvin," Zevrath said with the specific quietness of absolute authority, "does not issue orders in my palace." The guard blinked. "My lord, the decree was issued in my father's name," Zevrath said, "and subject to my review." He let that sit. The review has begun. What happened next took 3 days and felt like 3 years. Zevrath did not improvise. He had been building toward this for months, and the pieces were already in place. He simply activated them faster than planned because the timeline had compressed. The visiting lords at dinner were not diplomatic guests in any ordinary sense. 2 of them were from territories that had already privately expressed willingness to recognize a revised Velmor policy on Lunara descendants, contingent on a formal repeal movement from the throne. The other 3 were from territories with their own hidden Lunara citizens, their own version of my story playing out in their own palaces, and they had been quietly desperate for someone with enough power to move first. Zevrath had spent 6 months giving those lords reasons to be in that dining room on that specific evening. The sweep, Carvin's sweep, had forced the public confrontation before he was completely ready. But he had enough. Veskin and Orin both formally defected from the council majority within 24 hours of being approached. Veskin with relief so visible it was almost painful to observe. Orin with a cold, focused anger that he finally had somewhere to direct. The council majority collapsed. The purge decree was suspended, pending formal review within 48 hours of the confrontation in the corridor. I watched all of it from the Eastern Study. Zevrath installed me there, not as a prisoner, not as a protected ward exactly, but as something he did not have an existing category for, and so created one around me by default. He brought in Jorvin and Merrick and the laundry girl whose name, I learned, was Thessaly, the same name as my mother, which landed in my chest with the specific weight of things that are not coincidence, but feel too deliberate to call it that. He brought in the old groundskeeper, whose real name was Osric, and who had been performing Lunara mourning rituals in Zevrath's garden for 12 years, because 12 years ago Zevrath's father's guards had come for Osric's family, and a young Zevrath, barely crowned, had quietly arranged for Osric to disappear into the palace grounds rather than be taken. I had built a villain from a decree, and kept that villain operational for 3 years, because I needed something solid to survive against. The actual architecture of what had happened, the complexity of it, the inherited injustice, the man who had been maneuvering toward repair since the first day of his reign, was not a story I had permitted myself to look at directly. I looked at it now. It was harder than hatred. It was also, I was finding, substantially more true. Chapter 10, What Stays. The formal repeal was signed on a morning in early winter. I was there. Not in any official capacity. There was no established role yet for what I was in relation to the proceedings, and we were all proceeding carefully, one step at a time, in the specific way of people who are trying to build something without replicating the mistakes that destroyed the last structure. But Zevrath had asked me to be present, and so I stood near the eastern window of the council chamber, while the 7 lords, 6 of them now. Lord Thray had resigned his seat the previous week, unwilling to participate in the reversal of a policy he had spent 2 decades defending, gathered around the long table. The decree of purge, formally documented on its original vellum, was placed in the center of the table. Zevrath signed the repeal with a pen he had borrowed from Osric, a detail so deliberate it made Marek, standing beside me, have to look at the ceiling for a moment. I watched without speaking. My eyes were uncovered. No charcoal. The winter light through the window caught the silver of my irises and spread it against the council chamber's dark stone wall in 2 faint, luminous crescents. Lord Carvin looked at me once from across the table with an expression I did not try to read. Some things do not need moonsight to interpret. After, in the receiving room, Zevrath sat across from me in the same chair arrangement as the beginning. The same low table, different cups. No warm drink this time. The morning was cold, and no one had thought to arrange refreshments, which I found I did not mind. We sat in something that was not quite silence, and not quite comfortable ease, but was perhaps the space between those 2 things where real conversation lives. He looked at me with the gold-eyed directness I had stopped flinching from sometime around the 6th week of knowing him. "What will you do?" he said. "Not what do you want. not what are your plans. What will you do? The construction of it acknowledged agency, which I noticed. I had thought about this. I had been thinking about it for 3 days in the Eastern study, while the political machinery ground forward and the world shifted around a fulcrum I had somehow become part of, without designing for it. I want to find the others, I said. The ones who went into hiding the way I did. The ones who left and didn't come back to watch the decree fall, because they don't know yet that they can. Zevrath nodded slowly. The ones in Osric's records, he said. He had Osric's records, a private ledger the old groundskeeper had kept for 12 years of every Lunara descendant he had heard of or made contact with across the kingdom. There are 43 names, I said. He looked at me steadily. I know. Some of them won't come, I said. 3 years of surviving something teaches you not to trust the announcement that it's over. I know that too, he said quietly. His tone had the specific quality of first-hand knowledge, rather than empathy. I looked at him for a moment. What did you lose to this? I asked. It was a personal question. I was aware that we were not yet in a place where personal questions came naturally. He did not deflect. My first beta, he said after a pause, before I took the throne. He had silver in one eye, just one, it can manifest partially, and my father's council noticed during an inspection before I was king, and before I had any authority to prevent what they did. He stopped. The stopping was its own sentence. I held that piece of information with the care it deserved, and did not try to minimize it, or make it easier, or offer it back to him reframed. Some things should just be sat with. We sat with it for a moment. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning, visible through the window in slow, unhurried flakes. 43 names, I said again. I'll need resources. And a way to approach people who've been trained not to trust anything the palace offers. You'll have both, he said. Then, after a beat, I'll come with you, for the first few. I looked at him. He looked back with the expression I had spent months trying to name, and had finally found the word for, sometime in the sleepless early hours of the previous morning. It was recognition, the specific quality of a look that says, I have been looking for the shape of this without knowing what I was looking for. And here it is. The moon bond. The Lunara gift was not simply the ability to read other people's connections. It was the ability to recognize your own. The bond between fated wolves, the old texts called it. The one relationship in a wolf's existence that Moonsight could not merely observe but actually feel, from the inside, clear as a bell rung in a still room. I had felt it the first time he stood in my corridor doorway. I had spent 3 months explaining it away as stress response, as survival paranoia, as the predictable confusion of a person under sustained threat. It was none of those things. I knew what it was. I suspected he was beginning to. I was not yet ready to say the word out loud, and I thought perhaps he understood that, because he did not say it either. He simply sat across from me in the morning light, patient and gold-eyed and complicated and real, and the snow fell past the window between us, and neither of us looked away. I left Velmore Palace for the first time since my arrival 2 weeks later. Not running this time. Not in borrowed shoes with a stolen name, and a heart full of nothing but the specific discipline of survival. I left through the main gate on a gray winter morning, with a horse I had been given, and Osric's ledger in my bag, and Zevrath riding 3 feet to my left, and Merrick and Jorvin sending us off from the gate with the expressions of people who have watched something they cannot entirely name, and have decided to trust it anyway. The charcoal pot was still in my jacket pocket. Old habits do not dissolve in 2 weeks, and I was not yet ready to travel without it, and I thought perhaps I never would be entirely. That some forms of careful would always live in me as a permanent layer, the way surviving something shapes the shape of you going forward. But I did not apply it that morning. My eyes were silver in the winter light, visible and open, catching every detail of the road ahead, the texture of the frost on the stone, the color of the far trees, the 43 names waiting somewhere out there, in various forms of hiding, not yet knowing that the morning had changed. I would find them. I would tell them. Still here. And this time, when I said it, it would mean something new. Not just survival. Not just endurance. Something my mother had aimed me toward from the very beginning, even when the world made it look impossible. the chance to finally, fully live. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't leave without telling me where in the world you watched from. Drop your country below. And if you want the next chapter of a story like this one, make sure you're subscribed. I'll see you in the next one.